38. Poverty Reduction Strategy for the OECS. Getting involved in regional policy. The poor is always with us. I often wondered whether that was an indictment or an opportunity. Well, I was set to find out in 2012 when the United Nations Development Programme (UNDP) unveiled a new initiative to promote an integrated approach to rural development and poverty reduction in the Eastern Caribbean states. Three things enticed me to support this endeavor. First was that it called for an integrated approach to poverty. Having participated in a substantial way in developing the first integrated development plan in Dominica in 2002, could not help but feel that the development agencies were finally catching up with our reality 10 years late. But as they say, better late than never. Second was that this was aimed at regional policy. The measure being proposed was for the benefit of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States Secretariat, the OECS. The third was that it was directed at improving the well-being of people in the Caribbean. Even though in their lexicon, this was about reducing poverty rather than increasing wealth, I still thought you win some, you lose some. Economists in those days had their own euphemistic ways of measuring the reduction in poverty. It was the amount of people living below a prescribed poverty line, say about $2 per day. This was always a mystery to me. How could any household survive on less than $2 per day? That was only possible if we were only measuring the part of their livelihood that came from market transactions. To survive in a market economy on less than $2 per day automatically meant that you had to be spending, excuse the pun, living outside of the market economy. Being involved with an institution like the OECS Secretariat was also a novel affair for me. I had astutely avoided any involvement with regional institutions. It was like talking about the affairs of the local people without feeling the burden to do anything about it. I have never done any work with the Caribbean Development Bank. Yet still, these were the guys receiving the funds to implement solutions to Caribbean underdevelopment. The first contact I had with a Caribbean regional organization outside of its sponsors was with the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute, CARDI. I worked with a very eloquent senior researcher named Norman Gibson, now deceased. Norman always said to me, "I don't understand why you are not working in CARDI as against working with CARDI." There were good reasons for this. Linking rural poverty to food security, agriculture, and rural development was very popular in the Caribbean. It had its origin in a UN declaration called Rio Plus 20. The declaration, which was expressed in a document entitled The Future We Want, placed poverty reduction, I like their words, at the core of the Sustainable Development Agenda. This thinking reaffirmed the need to achieve development by, and I quote, promoting sustained, inclusive, and equitable economic growth, creating greater opportunities for all, reducing inequalities, raising basic standards of living, fostering equitable social development and inclusion, and promoting integrated and sustainable management of natural resources and ecosystems that support inter alia economic, social, and human development while facilitating ecosystem conservation, regeneration, and restoration and resilience in the face of new and emerging challenges. Wow! Did you get all of that? That was a lot of words, right? I know, but that is how bureaucrats lose themselves in trying to memorize each of these phrases. I always wondered how the young children in the madras schools in Saudi Arabia were able to memorize the entire Quran. When they are finished, is there any room left in their brain to think otherwise? Was this a comparable situation with our local and international bureaucrats? Did so many words leave them with no room to think otherwise? Some hesitancy in startup. The consultancy had some of the usual hesitancy that I have associated with regional institutions. From the beginning, we had some difficulties finding out what had happened to our expression of interest. After submitting our proposal in August, by September, our inquiry was met with an assertion by a junior OECS officer that they had never received an expression of interest from us. You can guess what's going on here. This is the usual response when the institution cannot recognize you as one of its boys. It harkened back to an incident I had with a UE professor in the airport in Melville Hall, Dominica in 1977. After responding to his inquiry by stating that I was working with small farmers in that island, he arrogantly stated, "I am from the University of the West Indies and we have never heard of you." Excuse me? I said I was working with farmers, not with university professors. In a protest letter to the head of the Economic Affairs Division of the Secretariat, Mr. Suma, dated September 5, 2012, I made clear the following observation. I assume that you do share our concern that regional institutions in the Caribbean need to continuously be seen as not only protecting their sources of funding by ensuring that substantial skills are brought to bear on their project activities, but also ensuring that the integrity of the procurement process results in value for money. In this context, we proposed a conceptual approach that expresses our exceptionality in responding to such imperatives as the land question, the livelihood factor, and environmental vulnerability. As it turns out, this was to become a continuous battle in our different understanding, not only of the future we want, but also how the heck did we get here in the first place? Why are Indian rural folk poor? In the first case, I had announced, independent of their background verbiage, that as far as I was concerned, rural poverty in the Caribbean reflected the need to resolve three persistent conditions. The land question, how land matters are administered at the national level. The livelihood factor, the struggle of entrepreneurship in the rural economy governed by necessity rather than opportunity. The environmental vulnerability concerns, making rural living patterns adaptable and resilient to natural disasters. To my surprise, the one person who completely disproved my assumptions of regional civil servants was the coordinator himself, Mr. Radinal Suma, who at that time was head of the Division of Economic Affairs in the OECS Secretariat. Suma was an excellent counterpart to work with. He listened a lot, which was a little disturbing to me, because it put the onus on me to keep the conversation going. Most importantly, he accompanied me to every interview I had with persons inside the Secretariat and also outside. This was challenging because he just sat there taking copious notes. In my interviews, I seldom took notes. If you said something of significance, I would follow it up with questions, and depending on how you responded, I would most likely remember what you meant. At one point, I wondered whether he was accompanying me to see what precisely I did for all this money. It was really not much money at that time. Assembling the data on agricultural performance in the Eastern Caribbean was easy because the OECS Secretariat was a standard depository for statistics emanating from the member states. I myself had written reviews of land administration in Grenada, St. Kitts Nevis, St. Lucia, Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Antigua and Barbuda. The Forum on Land Administration, which I had convened in Port of Spain in 2003, had also put me in direct contact with most of the directors of surveys and/or directors of agriculture in all of the islands. Filling in a situation analysis of poverty in the Bahamas, Montserrat, and Anguilla, and even in the British Virgin Islands, was an easy lift. Deciding on a poverty reduction strategy. To give you an idea of how complex this task was, I used to keep an activity list that guided me to the next task at hand. This list comprised 17 subjects that I had to fully address. Foremost among these was to ensure that the staff of the OECS Secretariat was in agreement with me on the historical facts, that is, the role of initial conditions. Now all of my ideological biases were beginning to show. Initial conditions were not simply observations of head counts of the proportion of the population living below a stipulated poverty income line. They were really the after effect, or rather the legacy of either previous policies or a previous organization of the economy or society. Initial conditions are very strong actors as they reflect a combination of factors already at work with the potential of redirecting the most well-intentioned policy initiatives as well as reducing any achievable gains in poverty reduction. When we say that our poverty reduction strategies must be results-oriented and must be focused on outcomes that will benefit the poor, we are actually describing the future we want. One that is characterized by sustained, inclusive, and equitable economic growth, increased opportunities for all, integrated and sustainable management of natural resources and ecosystems. I found the bureaucracy very hesitant to make that leap. In this sub-regional bureaucracy, they believed that the way in which they measured progress in poverty reduction was actually the solution. In their expression, the measurement should show that as the economy grows, the count of the number of households living below the poverty line should decline. In essence, this was saying that the solution is in growing the economy. In my expression, the measurements should show that as the population grows, the households considered to be in the poverty category should not be reproducing their conditions by default circumstances, but should show some capacity to escape that low level of well-being. There's a subtle difference here. As a side note, I'm going to take this opportunity to reveal the humble origins of some of my convictions. After After abandoning street protests in Georgetown in 1962, the only other street protest I participated in was in Port-au-Spain just before the November 7th general elections in 2007. I joined Dennis Pantin and a group demanding constitutional reform. Dennis was at the head of this protest march, which had so few persons that it didn't even muster the attention of a police escort. The leading banner read, "From winners take all to all take win." The system that is designed to produce winners and losers, you cannot fight to make the losers win unless you reform the system to produce winners and more winners. The current winners will not take losing sitting down. Our structural conscripts should be clear. Task number 1 would be to expose the fact that there are structures and systems that continue to produce the initial conditions of rural poverty, and that these will not be wished away by well-intentioned policies. Then we had to address both poverty reduction and inequalities as a synergy that reinforces each other. And finally, we had to generate opportunities in new enterprises that would offer a higher income growth and poverty reduction. These schemata must be built on the premise that while initiative is the responsibility of the individual, the creation of opportunity, that is strategic space, is mostly the responsibility of state policy. I started with some teasers, those riddles that would leave you frustrated that there isn't any solution, or that it is just a way to give you an artificial headache. The first call of duty for a sub-regional approach to rural poverty was to redefine rurality and give recognition to the extent to which the rural economy contributed to national welfare. Maybe we should reverse the balance between rural and urban public expenditures so that all these rural folk will start migrating back to their villages to qualify for government largesse. After doing some casual accounting, I had estimated that about 77% of parliamentarians in the legislatures of the Eastern Caribbean states represented rural constituencies. So clearly, rural was the place to be if you wanted to be elected to parliament. Why then isn't the national budget more pro-rural? I even produced poverty maps for these territories to show them the incidence of poverty in geographic space in case they wanted to become more targeted in their responses. Quality and legacy assets. What does this preoccupation with equality have to do with the constructs of poverty? We would like to believe that a policy of promoting agricultural growth is sufficient to overcome rural poverty. My thinking suggested that it was more the structures of inequality in small-scale farming which tended to see gains achieved during periods of growth become easily lost during periods of downturn. You see, Caribbean economies have never endured a period of sustained growth. So I would have to tell you how to reduce poverty in an economy that is up one day and down the next. Part of his success in this game had to be in policy recommendations which also introduced complementary measures to ensure rural development itself addresses other issues such as sustainability of small-scale production, gender inequality, income and policy convergence, and the rural to urban migration. Interestingly, one such pro-poor policy is to build resilience at the small farm level by wrapping it around the promotion of agro-biodiversity. The enabling environment for small farms to increase their productivity, especially those that are rain-fed, is not guaranteed by the technology of high-yielding seeds and chemical-based inputs. Why not try to reduce poverty by spending more of our money in reconstructing the small farming system to make it increasingly flexible, multifunctional and options-rich, capable of providing multiple services, and able to deal with change and uncertainty in its environment, both climate and the market. Expanding on the issue of gender equality, I sought to take the initiative that goes beyond helping women. I knew that the dominance of female leadership in households was sufficient justification to target women as beneficiaries. The poverty assessment study for St. Vincent and the Grenadines revealed that female headship was dominant in 8 of the 12 districts, and it was overwhelming in the poorest district of New Sandy Bay at 90.8%. But I wanted to ask a simple question. Where did the men go, and why did they flee? By now you should be sensing my drift. Gender policy was not only about women. The most important pro-poor thing you can do was to legalize legitimate forms of land occupation such as squatting, land capture, and land conflict by the poor. Resolving these in a way that creates an opportunity for the next generation in rural poverty to use land to better themselves should target the flight of the men. Actually, I introduced the staff of the Secretariat to a short lecture on building up the legacy assets of the poor. A policy adherence guide. My last concern was the fact that the OECS Secretariat had no sanctioning capacity to enforce their policy recommendations. Member states were free to accept or ignore parts or the whole of the policy. My proposal was to create an adjunct to the OECS policy on poverty reduction, which I called a policy adherence guide. Policy adherence was an approach that went beyond the simple intent to seek a better coherence and uniformity in our approach to poverty reduction. Poverty adherence sought to use the NGO community to force the convergence of policy intentions and institutional practice. Here's how I hoped it would work. I wrote a small 16-page booklet in the actual reduced booklet format that explained the basic policy options proposed in the integrated poverty reduction strategy that I had composed. This booklet provided any organized group with guidelines to conduct a review of their government's performance on this policy mix against the standard provided in the booklet. These two tools would empower any active group to express the level at which government was in adherence, that is 25% or 75%, with OECS integrated policy for rural development and poverty reduction. It was then the obligation of the petitioners to use their adherence level scores to lobby the international donor community to force a higher level of adherence from the government. The Policy Adherence Guide was meant to strengthen the policy dialogue with NGOs, local parliaments, and other stakeholders by providing them with a guide to gather needed evidence. That would be on either the lack of consistency or coherence of purpose or fairness in application of government policies that would impact on poverty and inequality. Unfortunately, Mr. Suma flatly refused to accept this adjunct as part of my report submission. I was forced to remove any and all references to the OECS Secretariat in the document and to distribute it privately to my friends and allies. You can still Google adherence policy in the reference below, www.academia.edu. In the end, this exercise was concluded amicably with a presentation to the staff of the Economic Affairs Division of the OECS Secretariat. I had received very useful comments from some avid readers of the document. They pointed out gaps relating to other available data within the Secretariat and some references that they felt were not quite accurate. Having corrected for these, I was able to have a very good final briefing session. With the exception of the non-admission of my adherence policy, I only remember one minor flare-up. A young staff member got up and said that I had failed to recognize the contributions of the OECS education programs to rural development. Well, accusing me of failing to recognize something is a non-starter for an amicable response. I sat still for a minute, and then I said, "Oh really? I didn't know you had one." Even Suma looked a little surprised at the comment. I then continued, "Oh, if you are referring to that certification system in which you give young people a piece of paper which neither entitles them to a job nor empowers them with the skills to create their own jobs, well, I prefer to differ. In my book, freedom is not achieved through an education system that teaches you to read. It is one when you can use your education training to rewrite the conditions of your deliverance." This is what I've been struggling to do, to rewrite the deliverance of Caribbean peoples from poverty and underdevelopment.